Today at the National Press Club, the Shadow Minister for Climate Change, Chris Bowen, on Labor's climate change policy and the job opportunities in the climate crisis. That's Chris Bowen delivering today's National Press Club address in Canberra.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's National Press Club of Australia and today's Westpac address. My name's Tom Connell. I'm a director here at the Press Club and also a political host and reporter at Sky News. Today's guest, of course, the Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Chris Bowen. His speech is entitled "The World's Climate Emergency, Australia's Jobs Opportunity." It has become a cliche to talk about climate change in Australia bedevilling the major parties in particular. It has, on the coalition side, been a key factor to them losing leaders. On the Labor side, though, it's been a key factor in them losing elections. In other words, no pressure. If you are following the conversation online, you can find us on Twitter. Our user handle is @PressClubAust. Our hashtag is NPC. Everyone, please welcome Chris Bowen.
In acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, let us also acknowledge some truths. Aboriginal people, as we know, have a special connection to their country. That makes the impacts of climate change a particularly important issue for our First Nations people. We must also acknowledge that climate change can and will worsen existing inequalities. Think of the impact of increased natural disasters, flood and cyclone in remote communities where housing is already poor, where isolation may be increased even further. Think also of the acute impact of rising sea levels on our Torres Strait Island brothers and sisters, who are already seeing sites of cultural significance literally washed away before their eyes. So in acknowledging the stewardship of our First Nations people over our lands and waters for millennia, let us also acknowledge the impact of climate change is another one of the many issues for which First Nations people deserve a constitutionally enshrined voice to the Australian Parliament. I also want to acknowledge some special guests here today. I'm honoured that the Chief Minister of the ACT, my friend Andrew Barr, is joining us. Under his leadership, the ACT is delivering one of Australia's most ambitious climate agendas, with a commitment to net zero by 2045. He's also joined by two of my federal colleagues, his predecessor, the former Chief Minister of the ACT, and it's a pleasure and honour to sit around the Shadow Cabinet table with Katie Gallagher, with the experience that she brings to bear in those discussions, and Alicia Payne, who will have an important role to play in Labor governments for many years to come. I also want to acknowledge Pat Conroy in particular. Pat is the Shadow Minister assisting me for climate change, and he was integrally involved in developing the policy we announced last week. He brings a valuable insight as a regional MP representing an area which is at the focal point of the transition in energy underway. Also, as Shadow Minister for International Development in the Pacific, he has developed a first-class understanding of the challenges and opportunities of climate change in our region. He's a valued colleague and friend. For many years, particularly under John Howard, Australia's approach to climate change policy was governed by the principle of no regrets. This was the concept that any potential action should be governed by the principle of not regretting the economic cost of that action. The irony, however, is that that approach has left Australia with plenty to regret. Australia, which has so often prided itself on punching above our weight on big issues, has been weighed down by dysfunctional politics, by the politics of division, resulting in a pathetic lack of ambition for our country and an embarrassing lack of action. While we were told that we would regret the economic cost of action, we've ended up regretting that Australia has missed out on so much economic opportunity. More petajoules of sun hit our landmass each year than any other country. Our wind resource is some of the best in the world as well. We're an energy exporting country, meaning we have the skills and expertise to lead the transformation to renewable energy. Australia, which has for so long searched for areas of comparative advantage, has for the better part of 2 decades taken a pass on a comparative advantage staring us in the face. We could have by now been well on the way to becoming a renewable energy superpower. Of course, we still can be, but we've left our run so very late, and we don't have a day to waste in catching up. Far too many deniers and delayers have run the toxic but effective fear campaign about the economic costs of climate action, and far too many are doing so still today. In a crowded field, the tactics of Scott Morrison at the last election win the prize for being the low point of sophistry and toxicity. Australians were told that action on climate change would come at a cost to the economy of billions of dollars. Instead of being treated to a contest of ideas, a genuine contest of ideas about how to lead the transition to renewable energy, the job opportunities in that transition, the Australian people were subjected to weeks of disinformation about how action would cost their jobs, their community, and even their weekend. Now, having sniffed the winds of political change with too many of their own MPs under mortal threat from voters fed up with lies about climate change, Scott Morrison and the LNP want us to believe that they are the party to be trusted with this economic transformation. Seriously. The guy who warned that electric cars would end the weekend, the guy who claimed that big batteries are as effective as a big banana or a big prawn, who derided renewable energy targets as nuts. These guys, including Josh Frydenberg as Energy Minister, who attempted to derail and destroy South Australia's world-leading transformation to renewable energy, these guys reckon they are the team to manage this massive economic transformation. And arguably, the even greater than the economic cost of the LNP's inaction has been the cost to our body politic of their toxic and constant identity politics of division. They've spent years dividing Australians and pitting cities against the regions on the issue of climate change. It's meant to be the job of the national government, and particularly the job of the Prime Minister of the day, to unite Australians around important national goals and projects. But when Scott Morrison sneers at the climate concerns of people who frequent city wine bars, when he talks derisively of the goat's cheese circle, when Barnaby Joyce dares to speculate that people who lost their homes in the bushfires were probably Greens voters, they betray that important unifying role. This pandering to identity politics of division makes my blood boil. And now, all of a sudden, worried about their urban seats, these characters announce a road to Damascus conversion, declaring that having divided Australians for so long, they are just the right people to unite Australians around this important national task. Ending the destructive politics division on climate is going to be a key task of an Albanese Labor government, just as it fell to Bob Hawke and Labor to bring national reconciliation after the divisions and the tumultuous decades to leading to 1983, so it will fall to us to bring Australians together in dealing with what is the world's biggest challenge and Australia's biggest economic opportunity. Let's be frank. Our party has paid a big price in these climate wars. We bear the scars. There are some keen observers who predicted that Labor would simply match the coalition's approach to climate to minimise the risk of yet another destructive scare campaign from a government that has no record and no agenda to campaign on. As if signing up to their weak and pathetic targets and effectively endorsing their politics of division might be an effective tactic to convince people to vote Labor. As far as I'm concerned, this was never going to happen. Because while we must, of course, learn the lessons of battles lost, we must ensure we learn the right lessons. The answer is not to eradicate our ambition, but to craft our policies to ensure we can win the argument that climate action is an essential element of, not a brake on, economic growth, investment and jobs. Our policy release last week, Powering Australia, was accompanied by the most substantial modelling ever released by an Australian opposition on any policy ever. We spent this year thinking deeply about how to design our climate policies with maximum economic impact for our country. And this modelling helps us assess and explain just what that impact will be. Several months ago, I outlined 4 principles that would underpin Labor's climate policies. Each of these principles is put into effect in the policies that Anthony and I announced last Friday. First, that net zero by 2050 is an absolutely essential starting point, but it's not enough. The drive to net zero must be accompanied by strong medium-term targets. Secondly, that those targets must be accompanied by substantial and well-designed policy measures. Aspiration is essential, but it's not enough. Third, that good climate policy is good jobs policy, and that should be reflected in the policy design. And fourth, that the regions which have powered Australia for so long must be at the centre of climate change policy going forward. They must not be an afterthought, but an absolutely central point of our policy development, and they have been. Those four principles and the policy we've developed to give them life mean that we can offer the Australian people more jobs, lower power bills, lower emissions. Our 43% emissions reduction target to 2030 is ambitious, but it's also achievable. It isn't an aspiration. It's the emissions reduction outcome of the policies we've designed, put together and put to the Australian people. It's a target with teeth. Inevitably, the Conservatives have derided it as not safe for the economy, and the Greens have argued it sends us off the cliff. Now, it wouldn't have taken a fortune teller to predict those responses, but I was particularly impressed with the fortune-telling ability of both of the parties on this occasion. They both held their press conferences on our policy before it had been released. Mr Morrison's was hours before. Neither had he seen the extensive policy work and the great outcomes for the Australian economy as a result of that work, nor had he seen the modelling, nor had he seen the evidence, and yet he had his lines and his spin ready to go. Their first instinct was to divide again, as it is in their political interests to keep the climate wars going. But it's not in Australia's. The Australian people, fatigued from the last decade, the last 2 years in particular, of the climate wars, deserve so much more than this. They deserve a government with concrete plans and an intention to unite Australians, not divide them, on this most important journey. We're seeking a mandate for our approach to climate change because that's an important first step to building the national unity around this important national agenda. Important too is explaining the principles of our approach that I referred to earlier and how our policies advance those principles. Firstly, that net zero by 2050 is necessary but not sufficient on its own, and we need a strong pathway to get there. And that's why Powering Australia delivers the 43% emissions reduction to 2030. We can't leave the task of net zero to a set of assumptions and a hope about technology emerging in the 2040s, partly because aggregate emissions over the next decade will determine whether the world stays below 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming, and partly because of the benefits for the Australian economy of greater ambition in the 2020s, the risk of missing out on the opportunity if we leave it too late. In many ways, the economy of our country is most analogous to Canada's because of our mutual reliance on resources. And I don't think it's an accident that our targets are so similar. While no two countries' policy mix will be the same, Powering Australia's target does return Australia to the sensible approach of similar economies. The second principle was that the target must be accompanied by policies. Now, Scott Morrison says a target without policies is meaningless. I happen to agree with that. But he uses that as an alibi not to have either. I use it as a driver to make sure we have both. Of course, we'd already announced substantial policies before last Friday. Our electric vehicle tax cut, our community battery policy, our 10,000 new energy apprentices, and probably most importantly, rewiring the nation, the urgent upgrade of our grid to unlock renewable energy across the country to improve reliability and resilience. But we always said that wouldn't be enough. And so last Friday we announced much more. That an Albanese Labor government will deliver solar banks to help lower income people and renters get access to the benefits of renewable energy. That a Labor government will ensure that the non-defence elements of the Commonwealth Government are net zero by 2030. That a Labor government would introduce real-world vehicle testing to ensure Australian motorists have more accurate information about fuel use and emissions when they buy cars. But inevitably, much of the focus has been on our announcement to improve the safeguard mechanism. Equally inevitably, the government has embarked on their usual scare campaign. Scott Morrison was in Cabinet when the safeguard mechanism was first designed. He was Treasurer when it was introduced. Of course, what we are going to do is take the government's mechanism and properly apply it to a baseline to make it consistent with Australia achieving net zero by 2050. A commitment that the government itself is meant to be adhering to as well. 9 out of the 10 biggest emitting facilities and more than 2/3 of all the facilities covered are committed to net zero by 2050 anyway. Many of them have more ambitious medium-term targets. Our announcement provides a supportive framework for those efforts, including giving industry the certainty that it has been so desperately calling for from the Coalition. The policy was recommended by the Business Council of Australia for that reason. They recommended this approach months ago to ensure that Australian industry can remain competitive in a decarbonising global economy. Indeed, we haven't gone as far as the BCA because, on balance, we don't think the coverage of the scheme should be expanded to additional facilities. I very much welcome the supportive response from the Australian business community over recent days. From the Business Council, that Australia's 2030 target is both sensible and workable, and that in particular they welcome the use of the existing safeguard mechanism. From the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, that Labor's plan is a chance to end climate uncertainty and that reforms introduce a baseline for the safeguard mechanism that are a sensible approach. And from the Australian Industry Group, that building on the existing safeguard mechanism is an obvious place for any government to start, and that making reductions firm and predictable can help underpin the transformative industry investments. Now, I'd like to think that's hard to argue with, but Scott Morrison and Angus Taylor are arguing. They seem to think they know more about the impact of Labor's policy on Australia's companies than those companies themselves. This is a policy business itself has asked for to keep Australian industry competitive and to drive innovation in a globally decarbonising economy. So if Scott Morrison and Angus Taylor want to debate about the economic impact of our safeguards policy, be my guest. Which brings me to the broader jobs impact of our policy. The third principle I outlined is that climate policy is good jobs policy and must be designed as such. Now, you might have heard me say before, the world's climate emergency is Australia's jobs opportunity. And the modelling confirms it. 52 billion of private investment unlocked because of our policies, 64,000 direct jobs and over 600,000 total jobs created by 2030. Power bills cut for households and businesses across the national energy market. This shouldn't come as a surprise because our independent modelling is very consistent with so much analysis by others. Modelling by Professor Warwick McKibben found a $35 billion jump in GDP by 2030 with a 44% target. Modelling by the BCA and Deloitte shows a 54% target, delivering 195,000 direct jobs over coming decades. And of course, the Reputex modelling for Powering Australia also showed that 5 out of the 6 jobs created by our policies will be in Australia's regions. Again, this shouldn't be a surprise. The regions that have powered Australia for so long will be the regions that power us into the future. The Hunter Valley, the Illawarra, the Latrobe Valley, Central and North Queensland, the Pilbara, Collie Bunbury. These are the areas that have powered Australia for decades, and they will power Australia for decades to come, with jobs being created there every day with the right policies in place. As we electrify everything that can be electrified, as we make that electricity more and more renewable, as we build the massive storage required through batteries, through hydrogen and through pumped hydro, thousands and thousands of jobs will be created in those regions. And we have the capability to begin manufacturing some of those technologies here with a boost from Labor's National Reconstruction Fund and our Buy Australian plans. Up to this point, we've largely missed out on seizing the opportunities for manufacturing in the new energy industries. Less than 1% of the 60 million solar panels across Australian roofs are made in Australia, despite much of that research and technology being pioneered by Professor Martin Green at the University of New South Wales. Australia is full of smart and hard-working people. It always has been, but we have a government which has turned its back on investing in the future. While we're a wealthy country, Australia's economic complexity, its productive knowledge, ranks 86th globally, just behind Paraguay and Oman, with the US and the UK at 11th and 12th respectively. Economic complexity is a key hallmark of innovative nations with resilient economies. In an unstable world, increasing innovation and complexity is a down payment on weathering future storms. Australia's regions are ripe to seize the opportunity to develop clean energy and manufacturing industries and export technologies like batteries, renewable technologies, and a world hungry with demand. We have 9 out of the 10 critical minerals for batteries underneath our toes, but we largely send them offshore to be developed, and then we buy them back at a premium. The key to seizing those opportunities is the skills agenda that Anthony announced yesterday. To become a renewable energy superpower, we'll need not only more workers, but more workers trained in the jobs of the future. Yet under the Coalition, there are 85,000 fewer apprenticeships and traineeships today than there were in 2013. 1 in 4 Australian businesses are experiencing skills shortages, and yet there are 2 million Australians unemployed or underemployed. That's why an Albanese Labor government will implement our $1.2 billion Future Made in Australia skills plan. 465,000 free TAFE places, including 45,000 new TAFE places, 20,000 new university places, and crucially to support 10,000 new energy apprentices to train in the jobs of the future. Frankly, we need a government that not only understands the future, but wants to seize it in Australia's best interests. Not fearmonger about it for short-term political gain, but to seize it for the long-term gain of our country. Now, the Australian public, probably many of them in this room as well, are fatigued by the toxic politics we've had in this country on climate change for well over a decade. At the state and territory level, and the business level, at the local government level, people are moving beyond it and getting on with the job. Now, there's almost a unanimous desire to create some policy certainty on the trajectory to net zero and to get on with the job, and for that you need the federal government. This is a pretty remarkable thing and a big change in recent years, but it's a great opportunity for a leader to bring the country together, to be ambitious and to seize the economic opportunities on our doorstep. Instead, the Prime Minister says 43% isn't the right number. It doesn't get the balance right. It's not safe for the economy. He says that before he's even seen the work. The Parliament heard from the Prime Minister a few months ago that if you're committed to net zero, you're automatically committed to a 43% medium-term target. That was before he committed himself to net zero. Now he says he can be committed to net zero without a 43% target. His dishonesty catching up with him yet again. Now, he says that 43% isn't safe. Now, if Labor's 43% isn't safe, what does the Prime Minister think of New South Wales's 50% by 2030 target? Or South Australia's 50% target? Or Tasmania's 100% target? Are these targets by Conservative state administrations unsafe? When the Prime Minister talks about driving jobs away from Bell Bay and the Hunter, is that directed to Peter Gutwind and Dom Perrottet? The reason Scott Morrison's attack makes no sense is because he only ever cares about the politics of the moment, about the attack grab that works for him in that interview. He doesn't care if it's consistent with what he said before or what he'll need to say in the future. He's always about the directly immediate political opportunity. He only ever thinks of his short-term political interest, never the long-term national interest. And despite the evidence, not just to the boost to the economy of powering Australia, but the huge shift in capital that we risk missing out of with more division, we'll see the scare campaign movie yet again. And we'll see it get more ridiculous, I have no doubt. Instead of creating consensus, the Prime Minister wants one more run at climate disinformation to try and get him back into the lodge. But he has a difficult task ahead. Despite having no policy to achieve it, he also needs to pretend that his climate conversion to net zero is real for urban seats under pressure. People are fed up with their representatives like Dave Sharma, Josh Frydenberg, Katie Allen and Jason Walensky taking their voting orders on climate change from Barnaby Joyce. The credibility cloud over his climate conversion is compounded by his mixed messages to the international community, as well as the Australian people. In Glasgow, the Prime Minister authorised signing up to a request that countries that haven't updated their 2030 target should do so next year. But hours later, he said our 2030 target was fixed. So he must deduce from the 26 to 28% target that remains that he's either hiding something from the Australian people or misleading the international community. That joins the ever-growing pile of empty promises to Australians under his leadership. It's past time for Australia to turn the page on this toxic climate politics of the last decade. Powering Australia is designed to do just that. I've listed off some of the biggest set pieces here today. Equally important is the intent to normalise the development and implementation of good climate policy in Australia by installing integrity to decision-making, ensuring the Treasury model risks and opportunities, that the Treasury models the risks and opportunities of climate change across the economy, as Jim Chalmers has previously announced. Acknowledging that climate policy is now a critical part of diplomacy and acknowledging the security threats of a changing climate, particularly in our region. Restoring the Climate Change Authority, ensuring the government of the day has independent advice available to it in decision-making and retaining those decision-making powers where they should be in the Cabinet. And the Climate Change Minister providing an annual report to Parliament looking at progress on targets and not consigning climate policy to only ever be developed in the fever pitch of an election or just before an international conference. It's a genuine effort to move beyond the toxic politics that we have lived so long. But frankly, that work can only begin with the election of an Albanese Labor government, with powering Australia as one of its key reforms. Not a paralysed Morrison government with the same rump of climate change deniers and delayers calling the shots as they always have. So now there is a real contrast of approaches between the government and the alternative government when it comes to the most important challenge facing the globe and the most important economic opportunity facing our country. They issued a pamphlet. We issued a comprehensive plan. Their target brings international condemnation. Labor's will pull us back into the range of comparable countries. The Morrison government was embarrassed at COP. An Albanese government will bid to host a COP. They won't introduce legislation because they'd be embarrassed on the floor of the Parliament by their climate change deniers. I'll introduce a climate change bill as Minister for Climate Change and will report annually to Parliament on progress because we want to be held accountable. What we're presenting to the Australian people is not an echo, it's an alternative. What we're presenting to the Australian people is not just an election policy, but a plan for we want to be one of the signature reforms of an Albanese Labor government. Nothing is more important than giving Australia a better future, than tackling climate change and seizing the economic opportunities it provides. Accordingly, as an Albanese Labor government goes about the task of navigating a better future for Australia, climate change policy will be at the very centre of that agenda. And I can't wait to get started. Thank you very much.
So, Chris, I might start on the overall target. 43% is your target. You are banking, obviously, the government projections. They were 30 to 35% and you banked 30. So, in effect, is your target actually 43 to 48%?
No, the modellers advised us that the correct conservative starting point was 30. They regarded that as being the starting point which was defensible from an economic modelling point of view. They did not regard 35 as a defensible starting point, but they thought that 30 was eminently defensible. That was their decision.
So you asked the modellers about that part?
The modellers have written the modelling and they've started at 30. They've then calculated the emissions reduction impact of our policies and they have advised us that that gets us to an emissions target of 43. That's what we've announced.
And so your updated international target will be 43
Correct.
Rather than 43 to 48?
It will be 43. When we notify the COP of our updated target, we will be informing them after a change of government that Australia's nationally determined contribution is 43%.
Kept that brief, so there's my example to my fellow journalists today, because we do have a lot of you in the room, starting with Phil Curry from the Australian Financial Review.
Hi, Mr Bowen. You mentioned the Greens on one side and the Prime Minister on the other side. As Chief Minister Andrew Barr, he can attest, sometimes you don't get a choice who you're in government with. And there is a prospect of a hung parliament, and even if there's not one, you're still going to have to get your legislation through the Senate. Is that 43% negotiable if it requires the support of the Greens, for example?
No.
Very succinct.
Thank you.
Jade Galeberger from the Herald Sun. Your plan presents a detailed roadmap to 2030, but it doesn't really explain how Australia would get to net zero by 2050 under a Labor government. Where is your plan and your modelling for that 2050, the 20 years that are remaining?
Thanks, but I don't accept the premise of the question. This is the modelling which underpins the plan to 2050. Now, of course, any modeller will say that they can provide more detailed information about the earlier years, of course. So, yes, it's more detailed about the earlier years. That's just the nature of modelling, it's the nature of economics. You have to make more assumptions about the outlying years. But the key is that we're also driving policy decisions to make that drive to net zero a reality. Now, we've always accepted, we have never denied that technological developments will play a role in getting to net zero. Of course they will, when we hope that they are as rapid and as beneficial as possible. But what we reject is the argument that you can just assume them into being. You need the policy frameworks in place to bring about the investment. That's what the safeguards mechanism is all about. So we've taken, as you would expect, just as the government, just as the opposition takes a budget as the baseline for its budget reply, the modellers have taken the government's modelling as the baseline for our modelling, but they've then factored in the impact of Labor's policies, and that impact is substantial, both to 2030 and to 2050.
So just on 2050, though, obviously the policy of safeguard mechanism goes out to then, and you've spoken about that drawing down. Is there any other policy framework that's set out all the way to 2050 in the document?
Well, I guess, Tom, the policies that we implement, some will obviously be implemented quickly, like solar banks and community batteries. They get rolled out and implemented. Safeguards, as you say, is a very gradual reduction to 2050, as is appropriate. So that's really the one which is laid out in most detail to 2050. But the other policies we're implementing will continue to have impacts and positive impacts even after they've after they've been implemented.
Laura Tingle.
I'm claiming presidential privilege and I'm going to ask you two short questions. The first one is, what role does science play in setting your targets, given that 50% emissions reduction by 2030 is the bare minimum that scientists seem to think is necessary, and what role will it play in future? And also, what's the biggest policy driver of reaching that target in your package?
I'll answer the second one first. It's a safeguards mechanism. The modelling shows has the biggest impact. Rewiring the nation coming in second. In relation to the science, of course, we are driven by science, but we're also driven by what's achievable, coming to office in 2022 for a 2030 target. Things that are achievable maybe in 2016 or 2019 become harder when you come to office in 2022. So, as I said, we put to the Australian people an ambitious, and some commentators have said too ambitious, higher than they expected. That's always inevitably going to be the case, but achievable policy. 43% is achievable. 43%, as I said, also happens to be the minimum trajectory to 2050. Experts agree. You're not really committed to 2050 unless you're around 43% in the medium term, because it's just impossible to backload the drive to net zero. But what we've laid out, both here in the plan, supported by the modelling, is the most comprehensive and detailed package for both 2030 and 2050, driven by ambition, but realistic and achievable ambition.
Julie Hare next.
Thank you, Mr Bowen. Can I take you back to yesterday with the education announcement? I've got to say I was speaking to a few people and the response was rather underwhelming. One Vice-Chancellor described it as a pitiful amount of money, and he said...
Vice-Chancellors want more, okay.
I can only hope things get better after the election. I wonder if democracy is truly doomed, and spending dollars on an education, hard to imagine you could lose an election on that, but that's where we are at the moment. So my question to you is this the extent of Labor's education, higher education, post-secondary education policy? Is Labor going to stick with the job-ready graduates funding model, which seems to be the bugbear of universities at the moment? And 3, what are the plans for Labor around international students? Because I haven't heard anything in the past year or so. Thank you.
Well, Julie, can I just say I don't accept the premise of the question, that it was a very substantial policy operating yesterday, and not just around universities. As a member of Parliament from Western Sydney, the proud host of a TAFE, the South West Institute of TAFE, and somebody who's seen TAFE underinvested in for years, and regarding TAFE as being absolutely essential to skills formation as we come out of the pandemic, I can't accept the point that you put, that somehow this was an underdone policy, because TAFE and universities are both dealt with, and your question focused on universities, and I respect that, but universities are just part of the skills formation task in Australia, and under a Labor government, TAFE will never be forgotten. TAFE is absolutely essential. As to whether there'll be further announcements, I'm not here to make announcements one way or another on behalf of Tanya Plibersek. I have plenty to announce in my own portfolio.
International students?
I have plenty to announce in my own portfolio.
Just on the policy, Richard Marles has said Labor's policy will mean anyone can do a TAFE course in any area with an identified skill shortage free of charge. So the spend, is that capped? Could that actually be more than...
Oh, look, it's a carefully designed policy to try and deal with the skill shortages which have been identified. Again, I'll let Tanya and Richard add to any further detail, but it's a carefully designed policy dealing with skill shortages which have been identified.
Greg Brown.
Greg Brown from The Australian. Mr Bowen, former ACTU President and Labor MP Jenny George says she thinks the predicted jobs growth under the modelling for your plan is quite unbelievable, given that just 64,000 of those jobs will be directly created from your policies. Now, looking at the modelling, it predicts that more than half of all jobs created, 306,000, will be through, and I quote, economic development induced via low power prices. So does this mean that the jobs growth under Labor's plan is largely dependent on lower power prices making unrelated industries more competitive? And can you explain the sectors that will benefit most from these 306,000 extra jobs that are created from lower power prices?
So, Greg, Jenny George's service to the Labor Party should be respected and is respected. But with respect, she's wrong. And this modelling by Australia's most preeminent energy economics consultancy firm, Reputex, stands up to scrutiny from anyone. And when I note that Josh Frydenberg was asked several times on Insiders yesterday to identify an error in the Reputex modelling, he couldn't. He sounded like Barnaby Joyce in every answer, but he couldn't actually identify an error. Now, in relation to the modelling is actually unsurprising, as I said, because it's quite reflective of other modelling. You know, it's quite comparable and in keeping with modelling by Deloitte for BCA, for example, with the Beyond Zero Emissions modelling, for example, which shows massive job creation from investments in renewable energy and energy efficiency, because this is a massive task. You'd expect it to create thousands of jobs. In relation to the details of the modelling, the methodology makes clear, for example, that the modellers have applied a multiplier sector by sector, so they haven't taken a one-size-fits-all multiplier effect. They've taken an appropriate multiplier sector by sector. In relation to the energy reforms, for example, electricity reforms, they point to 5 inputs, 5 papers, which they've determined to assist them to develop the multiplier effect. So there's direct jobs, as you say, there's indirect jobs, and of course there's job impacts from just the improved energy supply. But that modelling stands up to scrutiny from anyone, and I invite anyone, anyone who wishes to put alternative modelling forward to do so. But that is the modelling.
Given more than half of the jobs you're predicting...
Okay, I don't mind.
Given more than half of the jobs you're predicting are from lower energy prices, and that, you know, what are the sectors that...
That's where the market kicks in, Greg. I mean, you and I would both be markets types of a guy. When you reduce energy prices, the market that can step forward and determine where the investment comes forward. You reduce energy prices, manufacturing then has a chance for a new lease of life. When you reduce energy prices, a whole range of inputs can then be factored in to a lower cost of production. The market then takes off. That's the beauty of having good policy to reduce energy prices.
The ugly word in this area has long been transition. So your modelling has 64,000 direct jobs created. It's a big change we're talking about. How many jobs are lost?
As a result of Labor's policies, not one. Not one.
Not a single job.
As the modelling makes clear, Labor's policies create jobs. The modelling also accepts the government's modelling that, of course, global decarbonisation is going to have an impact on Australia. Both opportunities, massive opportunities from lithium mining and development, etc., and pressure on more traditional industries. That's in the government's modelling, that's reflected in ours. But our modelling has assessed the impact of Labor policies, and those policies are not just net positive, positive in total, in absolute.
So just one industry then, obviously, power generation's a huge one. At the moment we get about 70% of our energy from coal. In 2030 Labor has 82% renewable. I'm assuming there's a chunk of gas. What percentage of coal is there, and would that not mean...
82% will be renewable, and the rest will be obviously a mixture of traditional energies. And not one coal-fired power station closure comes forward as a result of Labor policy. Some people will criticise that, and other people will welcome it.
So what percent...
That's the fact.
What percent does the modelling have coal?
Well, the modelling says 82% renewable, and then there is no bring forward of coal-fired power closures as a result of our policies. Obviously, some coal-fired power stations are already announced closures. Your Lawn, for example, they'll be rolled out just as normal, and the mix will be as a result of whatever closures have already been announced. 82% renewable, the rest is a mixture of traditional industries, coal and gas.
All right, next question from Mike Foley.
Mike Foley from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Thanks, Mr Bowen. Just following up on that last point you made about no mandated bring forward of coal plant closures, let's just get into the numbers there a little bit, where you're taking as your starting point the government's own modelling, which is also based on the projections that the Energy Department released in October. That assumes that to get to their 30 to 35% emissions reduction, that coal power generation capacity will fall in the next decade from 25 down to about 14 gigawatts. You're bunging on extra renewable energy capacity on top of that. That 9 gigawatt reduction is actually quicker than the scheduled coal plant closures that the companies have nominated. There's an imbalance there. It's unexplained how under the government's policy that happens without coal plant closures. You're going further and harder on renewable energy. 82% renewable generation capacity is massive. That's huge. Currently we've got 70% roughly of power coming out of coal across the NEM. So can you just explain, getting into the numbers, how those stack up? I understand Reputex have made the assertion that no coal plant closures will occur. Is that just a promise that you won't bring them forward, but you'll let the market take its course? And it looks on those numbers like there's a couple that are dead as a dodo. You'd be looking at New South Wales pretty heavily, given your Lawn's already looking pretty rickety. So can you just explain how that's possible, getting into the numbers, and are you pledging that coal plant closures will not occur any quicker?
Mike, let me be very clear. No coal-fired power station closures as a result of Labor policy.
As a result of
Labor policy.
Renewable energy coming in?
As a result of any policy decisions, there is no earlier coal-fired power station. As I said just a moment ago to Tom, coal-fired power stations are scheduled to shut. Your Lawn and others, Liddell, then your Lawn and others to follow. The market will determine that. The market is determining that. Is there any policy lever that a Labor government will pull which will bring any of those coal-fired power station closures forward? No. If you're asking me to rule out that any coal-fired power station will close, no. I can't do that because they're already scheduled to close. What I'm saying is none will be brought forward. Those coal-fired power stations, frankly, will close regardless of who's in office, because that's what's being determined by the market. We should be honest about that. We should be straightforward about that. I am straightforward about that. I visited the Lawn power station. I've spoken to the workers there. I mean, as I said to them, I have to win the argument with you because you're the ones who have your jobs being determined by this conversation. We have to be honest about that. But in answer to your question about how all this can work, let me give you two answers, two complementary answers. One's the technical answer. Obviously, the government is introducing a capacity mechanism. We've outlined some principles which would govern our support for that, including it being consistent with net zero, actual payment for dispatch, encouraging renewables in. But we are very open to the discussion about a capacity mechanism. We recognise the need for it. But let me give you a broader answer. We are going to need more electricity. As we electrify everything that can be electrified, as we electrify our cars, as we electrify our home heating, we are going to need more electricity, not less. So if you say, well, look, we need X amount of electricity at the moment and X of it comes from coal, so if you put more renewable in, it ends up with closures, I don't agree with that, because we have to electrify everything that can be electrified. That's where so many of the great job opportunities come from in the regions. We have to generate more electricity, we have to transmit it better, and we have to store so much of it. That creates thousands of jobs. But the key is to electrify everything. Cars, heating, absolutely everything that can be electrified. That means much more electricity needs to be generated. That's how it all adds up.
Let me just ask a final one on this before we move on. Do you have a figure for how much coal would be in our electricity mix in 2030 with business as usual?
Oh, well, whatever the figure is the same as the government's. Like, we are not changing the coal. As I've said repeatedly, we are not changing the mix of coal. 82% renewable, the rest made up of a mix of coal or gas, and that would not change as a result of Labor policy.
Okay. Daniel Hurst next.
Mr Bowen, Daniel Hurst from Guardian Australia. It sort of follows up Laura's question from earlier and just casting forward in the next few years. We know at the moment there's a big gap between the pledges countries have made globally and, you know, what's needed to keep warming to 1.5 degrees. So you've said that a Labor government would take 43% to next year's COP. That's the sort of enhanced target that you'd be taking to next year's COP. If in the next few years, and there would be increasing pressure on all countries, particularly developed countries who have to lead the way in this, to increase their ambition in the next few years. Like, it's going to continue to build. So do you expect that the pressure will continue to build in coming years for enhanced targets, continually enhanced targets? And if other comparable developed countries do enhance their targets further for 2030, 2035, to what level are you open to then enhancing Australia's medium-term target in the years ahead?
Well, Daniel, the government's had 20 energy policies. We'll have one.
You have one for next year?
We have one, the one we announced on Friday. That's the policy we take the election. That's the policy we implement in the election. Not 20 goes, one go. That's our policy, and that's what we'll implement. It's an ambitious policy. Like, it's going to take a lot of work from all of us, government, industry, working together to achieve it. But it shall be achieved. It needs to be achieved. And under a Labor government with the right policy frameworks, it will be achieved. But that's the policy. That's the policy. We'll take the election. It's the policy we'll notify the COP of. It's the policy we'll implement.
Are you ruling out, I know you talked about, hung parliament negotiations earlier, you ruled out changing the 2030 target in that context. But in the years ahead, are you ruling out a Labor government ever contemplating a higher 2030 target than 43%?
No, that's our target. That's what we'll implement. It's what we'll legislate. I mean, we'll say to the Parliament, there's the target. We're not negotiating about it. We're not changing it. We're not amending it. There's the legislation with the target. Parliament can vote it up. The Parliament can vote it down. That'll be the legislation we put to the Parliament. That'll be the NDC we notify the COP of. That's the policy of an Albanese Labor government.
I didn't catch whether you've ruled it out.
And that's what we'll continue to implement until 2030. And then, like anybody else, we'll set a 2035 target at an appropriate time, just like the government has indicated they will.
And would that be linear, do you think, the 2035 target?
We'll assess the 2035 target at the appropriate time to lead the 2035, just as the government has said they will do, to be fair, and that's fair enough.
Next question from David Crowe.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks, Mr Bowen. David Crowe from The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald and a director of the National Press Club. And after Laura's precedent, I have two questions.
You're not the president, though, David. Laura, I can see Laura jumping to a point of order.
They're both on gas and coal. You talked a moment ago about the impact on coal-fired power generation. I want to turn the subject to coal exports and gas exports because both are impacted by the safeguard mechanism. What would happen to the economics of those export industries? Do you make a pledge basically to the Australian people that your climate policy will not make any change to those coal and gas exports as a result of what you will do with the safeguard mechanism? And a related question, do you want the expansion of the Beetaloo Basin to go ahead?
In relation to the two questions, the first one, we will not make any policy decisions to impact on that. We've been very clear. Those decisions are made in the boardrooms of Tokyo, Beijing, New York, New Delhi, London. They are not made in the Cabinet Room of Australia. We have to be clear, those decisions will be made, as the government's own modelling does indicate. There will be pressure on Australian exports as a result of the world decarbonising, 70% of our trading partners being committed to net zero, etc. We've always been straightforward. I was straightforward about that in my very first interview on the night I became Shadow Minister for Climate Change on the 7:30 show, and I'll be straightforward about it tonight when I'm back on the 7:30 show. But those decisions will be made overseas. The choice is, do you support those communities? Do you invest in those communities? Do you create job diversification? Do you get the renewable energy and the manufacturing going in those regions so that young people coming into the job market, that people impacted by job changes have choices, or do you leave them to it? With Powering Australia, we provide the framework for that investment to create those jobs. $52 billion of investment unleashed, creating jobs in the regions. That's the choice.
And Beetaloo?
And in relation to Beetaloo, we've supported the exploration, which I think is, an appropriate thing to do. In terms of exploitation, that is a completely different policy process, which is primarily a matter for the Northern Territory Administration. They'd have to go through all the necessary approvals in relation to the PEPA review, which has been implemented, a very significant number of recommendations implemented and accepted by the Gunner administration, which would mean that those proposals would need to go through a very rigorous process before exploitation proceeded.
Does it affect your 43% if Beetaloo does go ahead?
Well, that's not a policy decision for the federal government, as I've indicated. The modelling shows the impact of decisions available to a federal Labor government that we will make.
So just on the safeguard mechanism, if a coal or gas exporter comes to you and says, next year when it comes down again, when it ratchets down again, that's when we'll be uncompetitive, what will you do then?
Well, we've been very clear. For emissions-intensive trade-exposed facilities, and this is done facility by facility under the safeguard mechanism, our instruction to the department and to the Clean Energy Regulator is that no emissions-intensive trade-exposed facility will be facing a constraint greater than their competitors. That's factored into the modelling, and factoring that in the modelling, we still get the very substantial emissions reductions that the modelling shows.
Next question from Andrew Probyn.
It seems to be fashionable to have two questions.
Lost all control up here.
You don't control the lunch, Andrew.
Well, I'm going to troll this section.
We've just made TikTok, I think, you and I.
You and I, well, have to try harder. Safeguard mechanism. How, if you're running the Tomago aluminium smelter, how does the safeguard mechanism affect that particular company in that sector, given that it is extremely costly already to make aluminium, say the electricity price is going to go down? Secondly, what specific measures will you have to encourage hydrogen other than the market? It might need a bit of a push along.
In relation to Tomago has already made substantial commitments themselves. If I believe I'm right in saying they're committed to being predominantly renewable by 2029, for example. That's a very substantial commitment by themselves. They've made other commitments. 2/3 of the facilities are committed to net zero by 2050 themselves. Now, what this framework does is provide an ability for them to make those decisions in an environment of policy certainty, as they've been calling for. And in relation to Tomago, they would be treated by the Clean Energy Regulator like all the other facilities, i.e. the Clean Energy Regulator would assess with them what is achievable over a period of time. The baseline would be then set, and if they are emissions intensive trade exposed, that would comply with the instructions that we will give the Clean Energy Regulator. We'll be conducting further consultations with key groups, and we've already consulted wider with key groups, and I welcome the support, for example, of the key groups like the Aluminium Council and ARPIA, who are here today, who said they look forward to engaging in some of the details. But they've been very constructive, very constructive. But Tomago, just like the others, have their own commitments, and the Clean Energy Regulator would assess on a facility-by-facility basis. This is not a one-size-fits-all project. It couldn't be. You can't compare a coal mine to an aluminium smelter to Qantas, for example, all facilities covered under the safeguards mechanism. Of course they're going to have their own ways of reducing emissions. They're going to make submissions to the Clean Energy Regulator.
Yeah, you keep on using the Clean Energy Regulator as like a policy bodyguard. In effect, how would it work? Like, this is a negotiation.
They are the regulator, Andrew.
Yes,
that's why I call them the Clean Energy Regulator.
Okay,
it's their job.
In practice, how would it work? Would they be given a couple of hours, a couple of days, a couple of decades?
Oh, well, they've got until 2050. But they have to be showing progress each year to 2050, and the Clean Energy Regulator will take into account the capacity of each facility. As I keep saying, you've got to understand, this is not an economy-wide measure, nor is it a sector-wide measure. These 215 facilities are named facility by facility. It's not company by company. It's not, Rio Tinto this or BHP that. It's particular geographic facilities. Gas wells, aluminium smelters, coal mines. The only exception are the two airlines, who are treated slightly differently because you can't have a plane-by-plane assessment. Right, so what then happens is just like it does today. I mean, this is not a new architecture. We happen to think the architecture could be better implemented, but this is not a new architecture. There's already architecture that exists, setting the baselines, consultation with the facilities, etc. It's just not been effective enough. Emissions from these facilities have gone up 7% since the safeguards mechanism was introduced, not down. We need them to go down. to zero by 2050. That's what the Clean Energy Regulator will be tasked with the department, with me as the Minister, be tasked with setting it. But the reason why, Andrew, I can't give you a one-size-fits-all answer is because it doesn't exist. Because what will happen with Tomago will be different to Bowen Island, will be different to Qantas, as it should be, as it must be, as it is under the existing architecture.
All right, Sarah Basford-Canal is next question.
Hi Chris, Sarah from the Canberra Times. Friday's announcement included a promise to make the APS net zero by 2030, but the modelling Labor released on Friday showed that it would exclude defence and national security related agencies, which actually represent around 60% of the APS's emissions. Given it's technically only a net zero by 2030 promise on 40% of the APS, what's Labor's plans for the remaining 60%?
So, thank you, but not only did the modelling make that clear on Friday, so did our policy announcement with respect. Our policy announcement made clear we're exempting defence and the national security agencies from that APS commitment. So we were very clear about that in all the documentation, which we did on purpose because we do recognise the particular challenges for defence in particular, the other agencies as well, but particularly defence. I mean, it is harder to make that transition to net zero when you're running, some very power-hungry aeroplanes and ships and military hardware. What we will do is work very closely with Defence to try and get a proper plan in place for emissions reduction, but we will not bind Defence in particular to that net zero commitment because we are not sure it would be achievable or implementable on a reasonable time frame, and hence we are proceeding cautiously. We think the rest of the APS, all good, all fine. Power purchasing agreements, the states and the territories do them as a matter of course. The Commonwealth has very few. That is an outrage. I mean, there should be many more power purchasing agreements driving investment in renewable energy on behalf of the Commonwealth, ultimately the custodians of the taxpayers' money. That's not happening enough. Government facilities can have more renewable energy generated themselves on their roofs. Doesn't happen anywhere near enough. All that is doable and achievable in the APS more broadly. I think Defence does have a special case. I accept your point that they are a big emitter, but we also have national security can't be threatened. So therefore, we are taking a different approach of saying, well, with Defence, the Defence Minister and the Chiefs will, bring more accountability and transparency to their emissions reductions, but they won't be bound by the net zero commitment.
Is Labor undertaking modelling for that 60% as well to see if there is a target that can be reached?
No, the modelling is what we released.
Yep.
The only emissions reduction that we've claimed is for the APS excluding Defence and national security. So what we've announced is what we've claimed. If Defence can do better, we'd like that, but we're not claiming the emissions reduction nor binding them to it.
Next question from Simon Gross.
Simon Gross, Canberra IQ. Australia's annual emissions are now just under 500 million tonnes a year by the latest inventory. We had some climate boffins here a few weeks ago at the time of COP26, and they told me that by 2050, to get to net zero, Australia would need between 100 and 200 million tonnes worth of offsets to achieve that. Now, for you to get to 43% target in about 8 years, you'll probably need upwards of 200 million tonnes of offsets. Where do you see those offsets coming, and what criteria would you apply to ensure the credibility of those offsets?
So, and you're right about offsets and their importance, absolutely. Just taking 2050, for example, I'll get to your 2030 point, but I pointed out a few weeks ago when Angus Taylor made a big thing about it being net zero, i.e. there'll be offsets. Yeah, congratulations, I don't see that being a great revelation. It's net and it's zero, both are equally important. It's not absolute zero. And offsets actually provide an economic opportunity for the country. I mean, the modelling actually goes through the job creation opportunities of the offsets, of the carbon credits, and the investments that they undertake. For example, the modelling assumes that around 50% of the safeguard mechanism reductions come from abatement, direct abatement investment by the facility, and 50% comes from offsets. That's the assumption they make. And then it goes through the jobs opportunities out of those offsets. Now, in relation to your question about integrity, we have indicated a review of the ACCU system to make sure it's fit for purpose with carbon credits being invigorated by the safeguards approach, because it will be invigorated. It will lead to a bigger carbon credit market. It should be. and therefore it's appropriate we conduct a review of the carbon credits to ensure that they're fit for purpose, including their integrity, and we'll do that. That review is best handled in government and is indicated in our policies and reflected in the announcement we've made.
Andrew Tillett.
Andrew Tillett from the Financial Review and Director here at the Press Club. Mr Bowen, just on off topic from climate change matters today, but as a Sydney MP, there's reports of Gladys Berejiklian considering weighing in for Warringah. Scott Morrison has said today that her treatment is at the hands of ICAC's been shameful and she'd be welcome in Canberra. What's your reaction to that, given the important institutional role that ICAC plays in New South Wales politics?
Thank you, Andrew. I mean, I'll take that in a couple of parts. Firstly, the Prime Minister's attack on the ICAC on the floor of the Parliament. I've seen few more disgusting displays on the floor of the Parliament than that. The ICAC is not a smorgasbord in which you can pick off the findings you like and reject the findings you don't like. The ICAC is a statutorily independent body which should be respected, not undermined by the most senior politician in the country. Respected and protected by politicians, not undermined when they don't happen to like the fact that one of their own has been brought into question. I welcome the fact that former members of the Labor Party who've been corrupt have been dealt with ICACs. If you're corrupt, you betray the Australian people and you betray your party and the people who put you into Parliament. You deserve to be dealt with and you deserve to be jailed if appropriate. And we welcome ICAC looking at people in the Labor Party. We don't deflect. We don't criticise the ICAC for doing so. We support their work and defend them and protect them. It is absolutely outrageous that the Prime Minister of the day has undermined the ICAC and therefore not just undermined their work on Gladys Berejiklian, but undermined every single inquiry and investigation and finding that the ICAC has brought down. That's what the Prime Minister has effectively done. Undermine the ICAC as a whole and all the state and territory-based similar bodies, frankly, because they're all independently statutory based. When you attack the New South Wales ICAC, you're therefore, by implication, attacking all of them. And for the Prime Minister to do that because one of his own has been attacked was not befitting the office of Prime Minister. That's the first point. Secondly, I mean, I invite you to reflect on what would be said by you and by the Liberal Party if a Labor Premier under investigation by ICAC who had to resign was contemplating a move to the federal parliament. I do not believe that would get a leave pass or a free pass from you, it shouldn't, or from the government, the Liberal and National Party. It won't get a leave pass from us. Now, if they want to run Gladys Berejiklian for Warringah, that's a matter for her and for them. If they expect a leave pass for a Premier who's been under investigation by the ICAC, they won't be getting one. I doubt from the people of Warringah or from the body politic. And the final point is this. It again goes to the Prime Minister's fundamental dishonesty. He defended Gladys Berejiklian by saying there had been no finding against her. There have been no findings at all from that inquiry. They haven't released their findings yet. If he claims to know what the ICAC will find, I'm sure the ICAC will be interested to hear that he knows. Otherwise, he's lying.
If she runs and wins and there are adverse findings against her after that point, should she leave Parliament at that point? Would you expect her to?
Well, it'll be a matter for her.
But what would Labor say?
Well, I mean, let's see. I'll campaign for the Labor Party everywhere and anywhere, but I'm not going to claim we have a particularly strong chance in Warringah. Although I campaigned there last time, good candidate in Dean Harris. I don't think Zali Steggall would be too worried about Gladys Berejiklian running. But if she has an adverse finding from the ICAC, she should be dealt with like any other politician with an adverse finding from the ICAC. There are no leave passes, and it is not a smorgasbord. You can't say, oh well, you know, that one's not as bad as that one. An adverse finding's an adverse finding, and if she does get one, I don't know whether she's going to get one or not. Unlike the Prime Minister, I don't claim to have inside knowledge of what's happening down at the ICAC. If there's an adverse finding against a federal member of Parliament, that federal member of Parliament will be held accountable if she happens to be a federal MP at that time. Now, she should be held accountable by her own party as we hold our members who have adverse findings accountable. I mean, we have zero tolerance for corruption. Scott Morrison appears to have some tolerance.
Final question on climate. If you do lose the election, will you not be able to run a more ambitious policy than the coalition again on climate policy in the future? Is that the end?
Tom. More optimism, mate. Seriously, we're in this thing to win it.
And if you don't?
And we're in it to win it with an ambitious, sensible climate change policy. I'm campaigning to win. I believe we can win. I believe the Australian people are way over this government. I believe increasingly, Friday, Sunday, you're seeing the flesh put on a Labor agenda for government, which we are deadly serious about implementing. A Labor government with an appropriately ambitious agenda. Time is up for Scott Morrison. We intend to win this election, to leave nothing on the field to campaign for a working majority for an Albanese Labor government. And the climate policies that we're putting forward are an important part of that. Now, if you want to start talking about the 2026 or 25 election, good luck to you, mate. I'm focused on 2022.
Final answer down the barrel. I'm sure Angus Taylor, the Minister's watching. Are you up for a debate during the election?
Absolutely. I'll be here. And, Madam President, can we agree that if Angus doesn't turn up, we do an empty chair debate, because I will be here.
We'll call that a maybe. Ladies and gentlemen, let's conclude on that note. Please thank Chris Bowen.
Thank you very much.